Welcome to the 21st century classroom, where students engage with different types of texts through multiple modalities that are fundamentally shifting the way we think about learning. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, multimodal texts combine a variety of different modes of communication, such as visual, auditory, or written language, to convey meaning. They can be powerful tools for teaching and learning in schools because they engage students with different interests and make complex information more accessible and interactive to them. And it's no surprise that the breadth of multimodal texts on offer for students has expanded exponentially with the progression of digital technologies. In today's episode, we'll be discussing these issues and more with my guest, Cathy Mills. She's a research professor, author, and innovator in literacies and digital cultures at the Australian Catholic University, Queensland. Professor Mills has published over 100 academic works, including award-winning books, and her work has attracted over $2.8 million in research grants and industry partnership funds. Cathy's obviously well placed to share her unique expertise and insights with us on how various innovations and technologies challenge the traditional model of classroom learning with a range of new and exciting possibilities. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the Powerful Learning Podcast. G'day and welcome to the Powerful Learning Podcast, where our mission is to help you know more, do more, and be more by delving into the science of effective learning and teaching. My name's Luke Rowe, and I'm a university lecturer and researcher who specialises in evidence-based teaching and the science of learning. In today's podcast, we'll hear from Professor Cathy Mills about multimodal learning, digital literacies and technologies, and innovations in various approaches aimed at engaging students with different types of texts. But these innovations are, of course, a mixed bag. So we discuss both the benefits and the pitfalls of contemporary approaches to learning and spend quite a bit of time exploring its implications for marginalised students. I really hope you enjoy being part of this conversation, and don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to hear more about the Powerful Learning podcasts in the future. And please leave a review so that others can discover the podcast and join us on this learning adventure. So without further ado, I bring you my discussion with Professor Cathy Mills. G'day, Cathy Mills. How's it going?
Hello, how are you, Luke?
I'm excited. I've been looking forward to this, and I feel like having refreshed my mind about what your career's been like, I'm feeling like this is a timely topic, that your expertise is in alignment with what a lot of people are thinking in the education world at the moment. So I'm feeling pumped.
It's great to be here.
Well, for our listeners' sake, and just to give them a sense of who you are, can you share a bit about your professional career and what attracted you to the field of education?
Well, I would describe myself as being quite passionate about contributing to teaching the next generation of leaders. And that's how I came into teaching when I began as a primary school teacher many years ago. I completed a Bachelor of Education, and then I taught in several independent schools in Queensland. I then became a head of curriculum. I got very interested in the whole area of curriculum development and also inputting into the professional development of other teachers. And so I started to do some sessional lecturing after hours. So I'd teach during the day and then drive to a college an hour away and do night lectures. And I found I was really pumped at the end of those night lectures. I couldn't sleep. I was like, this is just amazing. And then,
after a whole day, you were feeling pumped?
Yeah, yeah.
So which institute was that? Which university?
That was actually Christian Heritage College, which is a small teachers' college in Brisbane.
Very cool.
And so I actually enjoyed that a lot. And after a while, I thought, I actually enjoying the lecturing more than my classroom work because I'd been doing that for quite some time. And I think I was ready for some new challenges. And so I did a Master's of Education, and then I also did a grad cert in Christian Studies because I was working in Christian schools, and I was also doing all their curriculum development in the Christian Studies area. And then once I finished the Master's, I was still sessional lecturing, but I met my PhD supervisor, she said, oh, look, I read some of the work that you've done and I'm really interested in it and you should do a PhD. And that was the first time I thought about the idea of doing a PhD.
So you stumbled into it rather
Yes, I stumbled into it, and I'd done a coursework master's, which, it causes a ton of problems. I should have chosen a research master's. So to cut a long story short, I ended up doing the PhD under a scholarship and was lecturing at the same time sessionally. And that was sort of in the early 2000s. And then I got a full-time position at the Queensland University of Technology, and that was in 2009. And
you haven't looked back?
No, and I became a full professor in 2016, and that was coming to ACU, Australian Catholic University here in Brisbane.
Great. Well, this segues into, I think, where you're at now. So now that we've had a bit of a snapshot about how you got here with your career, tell us a little bit about the major professional projects. Give us a bird's eye view of some of the things you're working on.
Okay. Well, I guess I think of it in terms of my research projects. I mean, I could think in terms of books, but one of the first projects I did, and it was a sort of interesting transition in my life because I'd also had a couple of kids after doing the PhD, was that I wrote 10 journal articles and I went to a professor called Alan Luke. Some people might know him. He's quite famous. And I said, look, I've got 10 journal articles and is that enough to do a postdoc? And he wrote back and said, oh, I don't know any opportunities at the moment, but I'll think about it. And about 3 months later, he called me back and he said, I've got a school that would like to do some like a digital intervention and I think you would be good for it and we could get you a postdoc if the project gets funded. Would you be interested in having a go at writing that with us, and we'll get a team together and we'll build up a team and see if we can create a postdoc position. So that was a really exciting job because we won the grant and my job was to run an on-site intervention in the sort of middle primary years, so grade 4 and 5. And that was based at the school and working with the teachers, and we had a lot of iPads and laptops and things like that. And it was an exciting project where we actually saw increased literacy outcomes for our Indigenous students, and we saw enhanced outcomes in digital practices for all the students in this low SES school. So it was a really exciting project.
So would you say that kind of exceeded expectations, or did you hit the bullseye what you were aiming for there?
I think it did exceed our expectations with the Indigenous work that we were doing. And I guess that's what led me then to my next project, was that the Indigenous leader who was at that school invited me to a school that he had then become the principal of, which was Himba Indigenous Hub. And that was my next project, which was really exciting. I spent 3 years working with this one Indigenous school community, and it was called a cross-cultural participatory research. So this is where the researcher doesn't come in with their agenda, but the community says, this is what we need and we want you to do this with us. So I did multimodal literacy practices with all the children in the school, just moving from one class to another and working with a different teacher each class. And the big key to that project was it was about doing things that in an Indigenous way of knowing and being. So it wasn't about just here's a bunch of digital practices from white Western people and a white researcher. It was about how do they learn and what's of value to them. And I had to learn from them about how to do multimodal and digital practices their way. And that was a really steep learning curve for me, but a really highlight of my career, I would say.
Fascinating.
And now there's a couple of other projects. I don't know if you want to hear about them all.
Oh, absolutely. I'm curious.
Was in low SES schools. So these were schools in Logan where, the school outcomes traditionally or have been lower in certain areas like literacy. And in this particular project, I was focusing on how do we get kids to develop a multimodal language of emotions. So this is about helping kids with their writing and about their expression, but giving them nuanced vocabulary to express their feelings along a sort of continuum instead of just, I feel sad or happy, teaching them the vocabulary so that they can then advocate for themselves and how they're feeling. And we actually saw some really improved writing from those students with this method and in a really short time. So that was exciting and I would say very successful as well. And then the next project was the one I'm doing at the moment, which is an ARC Future Fellowship. And this project is looking at how traditionally we've been looking at multimodal literacies very much in a way that's prioritizing visual modes. When we think about digital practices, a lot of it is on screens and the visual image is very prominent. But this project was looking at how a lot of the other human senses like haptics, which is your movement of your hands, and locomotion, like even just moving your feet, gets sort of gets backgrounded because we've tended to prioritize the visual mode. And so this project was looking at how all of our senses work together. And I've been doing a lot of things in maker spaces and using virtual reality where kids actually do move around in the virtual space and locomotion is part of that. Same with filming where kids are behind the camera and they're moving around. And we look at the film footage and we say, oh, let's look at the great things in this multimodal text, but we forget that the student has actually moved around the world and their feet have taken them to traverse these different areas. And that's where the learning is as well, not just, those visual modes of the screen.
Yeah, it's such an impoverished way. And I think this is why I love sort of reading some of your work, because it helps me unearth some of my own assumptions where I think, well, hang on, we've been looking at this two-dimensional notion of digital technology, and I think we are happy with that status quo. I mean, even now, we kind of have this one medium through sound and auditory interaction.
Yes.
But there's we're a multisensory being. We are greater than the sum of our parts in terms of our senses. And I often forget that when we're looking at digital technologies. We forget that haptics and all the touch sensation can really enrich our learning experience. So it's really helpful when people like you are advocating for that, because it gives a different dimension, adds a bit of color to this otherwise somewhat mundane and black and white view of how we experience digital technologies.
Definitely. And what counts as a literacy practice too, because we've tended to see it very much in terms of, with print books, we think about you turn the page a certain way, and that's been very predictable since we've had the printing press. Books aren't changing hugely, but then now we've got these technologies that are constantly changing, and so they involve a lot more variety of movements that we didn't need to draw on as much in the past. So the changing media formats and the materiality of that's changing is actually making us wake up and say, hey, this is interesting. Kids swiping on an iPad is different to, painting with a paintbrush, I guess. And yet, all along we've been doing different things materially, but because it's changing so much, I guess it gives us a point of difference.
Yeah. My daughter, it was really interesting watching her on an iPad. She started turning pages with her nose on a Kindle.
Oh.
And it's like, why are you doing that, Charlotte? And she's like, oh, because I can and it's fun. And so she would get her nose and put it down to the bottom right corner where you've got that kind of peeling bit, and she'd pull it up. And it's like, can't you do that with your hand? No.
That's interesting.
So she found it very fun. She goes, so you can't do this with a physical book, Dad. So, look at those amazing advantages, hey? You can turn pages with your nose.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so silver linings, right? So in terms of this idea of, we've mentioned the idea of multimodalities and multiliteracies. Can you kind of give us a conceptual overview of what that means and what those terms mean?
Yeah, good one. I've just been dropping the terms as if your audience knows all about this. But I guess if they're teachers in schools in Australia, they would be aware of the term multimodal literacy because it's in the Australian curriculum I think I found over 100 times.
You bet you're hoping they're aware of it, because you're assuming if they
Well,
read
actually,
that.
when we worked with teachers, they do know a little bit about it.
Yeah. No, I'm
So
trying to be a bit hyper cynical there. So no,
yes.
I've got to have better faith in
Well,
our.
it's actually really simple. Like, it sounds fancy, but it literally is multiple modes. It's just 2 or more modes. So if you have a print and you've got images, you've got a multimodal text. So technically, a picture book is a multimodal text. So multimodal doesn't actually necessarily mean digital. And so that's why we'll often, if we're being finicky, preface our sentences with, digital and multimodal text, because a multimodal text could actually not be digital, like a dramatic performance, for example, where you've got gestures, you've got voices, you've got sound effects, maybe props. So so a multimodal text combines 2 or more modes, and we know that the modes all have they're juxtaposed or have interrelated meanings. So we don't necessarily pull apart the modes and say this is saying this is saying that, but we also look at how the modes work together to create meaning. So but because we've got the internet and other media since sort of the Y2K era, multimodal texts have become more prolific. And that's why I think this has been of great interest to researchers of literacy, because we're not seeing texts that just contain words on their own on blank pages as often. And there's a lot more audio and visual. And we see, kids on YouTube and just a bigger circulation of these texts that combine multiple modes in quite effective ways. And so if we want to communicate, we're going to have to get facility with all of these different modes.
Yeah, and I notice the trend now in children's applications for reading, learning how to read. They will have options for being read to, where you can click on the paragraph and it'll read to you, or they can sound out words, or they can go down the rabbit hole of looking up what the word means if they can go on the dictionary prompts. So there's this whole interactive component, and there's multiple options there for these children to learn and engage with the text. That's right.
There's a different interactivity in these multimodal texts often built in. So with an ebook, children aren't going to just do a linear reading where they start the beginning and go to the end, because they're going to click on all these different hotspots and make things happen and animate it. And like you say, they can have the words read to them, which is actually a really effective tool for early readers. It's a bit like the old cassette readings that we used to have, where you would just play the story on a cassette and the kids would turn the pages of a book, and that way you could present them with books that were more difficult than what they would normally read on their own.
Yeah, you can push the boundaries, and the great thing for parents is you can fall asleep on the couch whilst your child's still being read to. So
but there's scaffolding built into the technology.
That's the word. Yeah, absolutely. And it can scaffold them beyond their own capacity. I suppose that is by definition what scaffolding is, but I think it pushes the boundaries of what they can do to that next level. And I see a great opportunity in that. But I also, just in terms of picking your brain about the flip side of that, what about when a child does pick the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, and click read to me when they should be reading themselves, or they look up a dictionary definition when they could have challenged their own recall and perhaps got more learning benefit from it? Do you feel like there's a potential downside?
No.
Am I being too cynical?
Let your child enjoy the book. You just
I worry about these things. Don't
because they're going to play with the book and they're exploring and discovering the book for themselves and
I just need to get out of the
way. And it's not meant to be a test of their abilities. So by all means, let them press all the buttons and don't dictate. I mean, we used to years ago talk about how kids role play reading and so on. So even, before we had all these digital technologies, it was about getting kids to just, if it's a bath book, that's, in the waterproof material, it doesn't matter if it's upside down, like they're just learning to turn the pages, or and just getting used to having books around and looking at the pictures and so on. So it's all those early literacy experiences are all important, and they build up to that readiness to learn how to read.
The readiness, and perhaps even the love of learning and the love of books themselves.
Right.
Certainly if you've got fire breathing father over your shoulder saying, don't click the audio option, read it yourself, it's probably going to suck a little bit of the joy out of that experience.
Yes, exactly. I remember experiences like that, when I was a kid, in doing these books that were way too difficult at home. And so, you're stumbling along trying to decode one word at a time because your parents didn't know, how to judge the right book for the child. And so you get these stressful reading experiences that, that are not ideal. You really want kids to be able to enjoy reading, and, that there's lots of books that are even easy, really easy books where there's just one picture and one word. And that is they can have huge success with that. Yeah. And that feeling of success and confidence then takes them to the next book.
Yeah, and becomes a positive feedback loop.
That's right.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Multiliteracies. We didn't get on to that second part of your question.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, so we've now got kind of three terms that are I'm seeing in my mental Venn diagram, where we've got multimodalities, multiliteracies, and digital literacies, and we're kind of looking at all of the overlap there. So let's go into multiliteracies just quickly.
Yeah, so the multiliteracies term is a cool one. I remember walking through a library, because, yes, I do like libraries, and just wandering around and finding this book that had the word multiliteracies. And I was like, wow, that looks exciting. Grab the book. It's two key arguments by the New London Group. They wrote an article in the Harvard Education Review in 1996. And they said that there are two big things happening at the moment in our world of literacies.
1996?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Really
I think,
prescient.
Yeah, they were ahead of their time. This is what I believe. The first argument is that there's an increased circulation of text because of the internet and mass media and changing forms of the changing communications environment. So already they could see that there was a kind of exponential increase in the flow of textual practices in society. And the second was cultural and linguistic diversity was increasing, and they attributed this to cultural globalization. So because we have the movement of people across different national borders, we're going to have more cultural and linguistic diversity in local contexts. And this in turn affects the languages and literacy practices that we work with in an everyday basis. So those two key arguments were their main point. And they then developed that work in the year 2000. They produced a book which kind of took those ideas further. And then basically, when you think about it, the Y2K era from 2000 on was really when the internet started taking off in places like Australia. I mean, if you look at graphs of what percentage of the population was using the internet then compared to now, it was much less, and it is just literally increased. And then we got mobile devices, smartphones.
And the internet speed went beyond snail pace. That old dial-up sound haunts me to this day. I just remember the kind of slow process of. And
then we had Web 2. So the Web 2 is the read-write web. So instead of just viewing the web, everyone could be a web producer. Everyone could blog. Everyone could post. And then we got social media. So I think that whole trajectory, I guess they got in even before all of that. They could see this these trends happening. And I think since then, their main arguments have really held true, in fact, been illustrated in more ways than one.
It's fascinating, that whole notion of the globalization pushing the diversity in the sort of multiliteracy space is, I wonder if it's got a sort of narrow arc that's starting to turn the other way, in the sense that we're seeing not necessarily the cultural homogenization of languages and literacies, but certainly a dominance of certain cultures, like American culture. We have this phenomenon that we're seeing, and I think there was some terms, I can't remember the technical terms for it, but where children are picking up on some of the accents of other cultures. I know that during the pandemic, we had a news article saying that people were watching so much Peppa Pig in America that there was American kids picking up British accent. Hello, Daddy. How are you, Daddy? And sort of using those terms like the whole UK British English versus American English. And then I think the other way around, where our biggest export from Australia, Bluey, was helping sort of spread this Australianization of the English language to other parts of the globe. So, it's interesting that diversity is there, but do you think it's worth considering the possibility that it also runs a risk of homogenizing cultures and sort of wiping out some of that diversity?
Yeah, I think so. I think the New London Group sort of talks about this. It's kind of like a paradox that we have, both things happening at once in different contexts.
Right.
So yeah, no, you're right, and they bring that point up, which is so true.
Glad there's brighter minds than mine onto it. Yeah. So let's sort of dig into the details here. Like, what are some of the trends, in addition to what we've just discussed, that you think are emerging in this space of multimodalities, multiliteracies, and digital literacies?
Well, I mean, interestingly, like from my first projects, I was really looking at what's called a socio-cultural approach to literacy, where we were recognizing that each child comes from a family background where there's certain types of linguistic influences on their life, and that we need to respect the community differences in each group of students, discourses and so on. And so those early theories were really powerful for me, especially when I came to things like the low SES schools and the Indigenous work, that we have these communities of practice, and that we can't just say there's this one standard grammar or English that has to be imposed on everybody. But at the same time, we're in a world where there are certain types of discourses that are given they attract more economic wealth, for example, and we're in that sort of environment. And so there was this kind of tension between, supporting the languages of our backgrounds, but also going hand in hand with the new things that kids need to learn as well. And so that theory I found was really helpful for me in that work that I've done. But then as I continued researching the whole multimodal literacy practices is a kind of, I guess, a theoretical frame then that I've worked with, and it's been really helpful as an interpretive tool in my work. But more recently, I've been looking at a theory called socio-materiality, where we look at how different media have basically different materials, and in them are built in the sort of technologies of the culture that are that shape how you use those technologies.
You can't separate them, can you?
No.
And people are often blind to that, kind of inbuilt the inability to separate culture from product, right? These things are together.
Yeah, and so I would say at the moment, like for me, that the socio-material aspects are quite interesting to me in terms of the array of different media and how the materiality of the media shapes the way we think as well. So they've found that, when people, for example, write lecture notes by hand versus typing them on a keyboard, that they retain the information differently. So actually the people who write with the pencil or pen actually retain the information much better than the people who are typing on a keyboard. And some of the reasons for that are things like the fact that when you write, your hand and eye are focused in that same place. So you're looking at your writing where your hand is and they're in unity. Whereas when you are typing, you're looking at the screen and your hand and where your eyes are looking are separated. And in turn, that means that you don't retain the information as well. And so I guess the materiality is shaping how we think and how the mind works. And so when we look at iPads or smartphones or
now you're scaring
media,
me. I'm hearing
AR, virtual reality, mixed reality, every new technology that comes out, what is happening then with how we read and write and perceive information and how we filter out distractions and reading pathways and there's so many different aspects to this. It's not just, oh, you've learnt to read and write on a piece of paper, now you can do it anywhere. Because there are these different influences in the materiality of the media.
I'm so glad at least someone's questioning that, though, because we've put the cart before the horse. You know, I think educationally we don't yet understand the implications of just how far ahead the technology is from our understanding of its consequences and impact on how we learn and how we develop. And how our students engage in those. I mean, you mentioned the whole the distraction aspect. People have become, it's almost become a cultural running joke that these iPads, we have to factor in when we're engaging in an iPad, the distraction time, the procrastination time, the notification time, and that's built into our thinking now. But those assumptions don't carry with some of the older technologies and the traditional ways of approaching it.
And the other thing is often we don't think about schools needing to have a role in that. So we often think, well, let's just give them a bunch of basal readers and, that are all benchmarked and so on and do what we've always done. But then in the meantime, they've tested kids in grades 4 and 5 and found that their comprehension's already suffering when they do deal with online text because they haven't got the skills. And you actually need more self-discipline when you're in an online environment reading where there's lots of different pathways and you've got to have synthesizing skills. You have to be really disciplined in where you're going on the internet and navigating that. And so those skills can actually be taught, and that needs to be part of our reading curriculum. But yet I don't feel like, education's really got to that point yet where we know exactly what's different about these texts, where there's been good advice given for teachers so they know what pedagogies to use with kids, and teachers are actually asking and coming to us and saying, what should we be doing differently in our curriculum to account for these digital texts? I mean, it's something teachers want to know, and that's why we need research on these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess when they do come and ask you those questions, they're not just arriving at this conversation with a blank slate. They've got their own assumptions. So can you maybe give us a sense of what some of the maybe misconceptions and assumptions that teachers are bringing to that conversation when they do ask you?
Well, I think when they ask us, actually, what probably triggers it a bit is things like, oh, NAPLAN's going to be moved to a digital mode. Yeah. And then suddenly everyone's like, oh, what if our kids don't know how to deal with a digital NAPLAN test? So I think sometimes it can be issues like that where it comes down to, schools are under pressure in these kind of pressure cooker testing situations. Yeah, so I think that's one of them. One of the triggers is things like digital testing.
Yeah, and there was a lot of assumptions around that. Having a psychometrics background myself, I know that there are differences when you give people the same test online as you do, in a face-to-face or proctored context versus a group context. And I think that, the details around that were somewhat lost when we're all forced into this online mode of learning and engaging with testing materials during the pandemic. And we assumed that there was a direct correlation between or correspondence between those two modes of engaging. But it's not the case. It's not always the case. Those assumptions don't always hold. So I think that's a huge misconception there. And it's sometimes at the detriment of supporting teachers and students to, optimally engage with those modes of learning and performing. Yeah. So you've worked with, I mean, I'm seeing a common theme emerge with some of your work, particularly your earlier work, and even recently, having seen you present on a few things, you've obviously got a real passion for working with people on the edges, on the margins of society, low SES demographics, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and you've obviously got a heart for that. So what sort of things have motivated you towards research in that space, and what sort of things do you want to achieve in that area?
Well, I think that if your research is not sort of cutting through the issues that are, I guess, the big issues, it's hard to see it making a difference. And I see that inequities in society are just a huge thing that impinge on education. I think too often people think that education is just going to fix everything, but really we have to see children as part of this, of this huge ecosystem where, they might be coming to school with a whole number of basic needs not actually met, whether it be food, whether it be, a stable home environment, whether it be mental health and so on. And as when we study something like literacy, it's easy to think, oh, that's all, another topic. But really, we do need to see how are we going to help, kids who come from these kinds of backgrounds and are disadvantaged. Can schools actually, help them level up or catch up, so to speak? And I believe to some extent we can. With good pedagogies, we can make a difference, and we can, you can teach a kid to read in 10 weeks. And we've seen that with certain reading approaches when kids have really well presented pedagogy. So, and that can make a huge difference to a kid's life. They do have to be at school. So there's certain, if the kid's not showing up at school and they're constantly absent and things like that, like there's only so much you can do. Getting them to school has been, for some schools, part of a big issue. Yeah. And once they've got them there, then what's the best way to actually give them these, skills that they need in a short time that they'll be able to catch up. And we did see, when you look at even things like NAPLAN scores in some of the low SES schools, we could see that when kids arrived at school in prep, there was actually a big group of students who were quite, without that and other testing, but from their first test in grade 2, that prep year 1, 2, and then the work that was done from 3 to the test in grade 4, you could actually see the tail end being caught up slightly.
Wow. So you minimise the inequality there.
That's right. And by the time they get to year 6, it is actually less. So schools are doing something. These kids that are coming in with very low skills at the beginning are, over the course of their schooling, the gap is getting less. But and I mean, that's encouraging, because it means that as a teacher you can, make a difference and help these kids to catch up, even if it takes longer. It's a long game for sure. And I'm intrigued by what you were saying before. It makes me feel like sometimes we get caught up in the next link in the chain instead of seeing the whole horizon or the arc of our education system. And this idea of seeing education as a panacea, as a silver bullet for inequalities is somewhat naive. But on the other hand, to say that it's not one of the most powerful vehicles to eradicate inequalities and if not mitigate and minimize them, if that's more pragmatic, well, yes, it can happen. And certainly it's lovely to see that your career is a testament to that, particularly with some of the marginalized groups in our society. So it's encouraging. People need to hear these stories, because unless we're exposed to the encouraging success stories, how do we bring that to scale? We're not going to know. We're not going to know how to bring that stuff to scale. We hear so much doom and gloom stories about vulnerable populations, and I think sometimes that needs to be balanced with hope, the stories of hope like this. And certainly your work is absolutely resonating with that hope. That's right. I mean, sometimes it's not even just the pedagogy. So sometimes we have to look at what are the key issues for the community at that school. And it might be something like that, the teenage girls have babies and that is taking them away from school. So, for example, at one of the schools I worked at, they actually provided a childcare centre for the young mums to keep the girls at high school for longer. And then while the babies were in that care at school, they were getting literacy practices from the get-go and helping that next generation of children. And so, for each school, it might be a unique kind of complex set of problems, but it's about looking at all of the issues that are involved and at stake in someone's education and making sure those barriers are removed.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What do you think in that population of, say, teenage mums and teenage dads, I suppose, but they're often not as represented in that population? The push for online education, has that done a lot of good for that in terms of making it more realistic for a teenage mother to engage in education, to complete their education? Or do you feel like there is...
I think that there's huge digital divides, and that is something that's come out from our research during the pandemic, was that, we've got huge numbers of children in different communities who have no access to the internet, for example. And, one of the projects I often think of is when I went to America, actually, in Oklahoma, we were doing this really fantastic, program with Arduino kits and junk art digital sculptures where kids were learning how to program parts of sculptures and all this sort of thing. And at the end of the program, all of the kids were given an Arduino kit. And one of the mums brought her kids brought her kids over to me, and she said, "Oh, thank you for the program. The kids have really loved it. And with this kit, can we just use it with a mobile phone?" And I said, "Oh, no, you need a personal computer." And she said, "Oh, we don't have a personal computer. We just use the internet from my phone. So I've got internet off my phone, and that's what we use." And I suddenly realized, like this assumption that there's personal computers in every home, like I just would have thought that would be the case, in this day and age, but it's not. So can you imagine when you've got lots of families like that and pandemic hits and we're relying on online learning, when, they're going to have to sit outside McDonald's trying to get Wi-Fi and, and a lot of teachers went around dropping off iPads and things to families because they knew that they didn't have any digital technology at home.
Oh, those teachers are my heroes. But the fact that they had to do that is tragic.
Yeah,
and that
it
story
shows you in their own time, this type of thing is what teachers do. Because they can see the problem and they want to make a difference.
And that's
there's no infrastructure in place. So they have to go do it, hop in their car and bring iPads around during a lockdown.
Like it is kind of unbelievable, but at the same time, this is real, and we have to come to terms with those digital divides. Just before we go further on that, I think it's a really interesting path to go down in terms of our discussion. But this term digital divide, that's a pretty that's bandied about quite a bit. When you say that term, what do you mean by that term?
Well, there's lots of digital divides. So research shows that one of the biggest factors in who loses with technology is the poor. So basically your SES determines what access you have to technology. And then we've also got groups that we can identify, such as geographically remote. But that tends to go hand in hand sometimes with the lower SES. So the more rural you go, the more low SES, the more, and then you've got other issues of internet, black spots and so on. So, and then also, the research from America is saying that, the African-American population are still marginalised in digital access. And in Australia, we know that our Indigenous population is often marginalised in terms of digital access. So I'd say they're the main groups, that the main sort of fault lines, or digital divides. I would emphasise the plurality of that.
And do you feel like this is, do you feel like it's accelerated that digital divide? Or sorry, I suppose this kind of answers the question, but has the divide that was already there been accelerated by digital technologies? Do you feel like it's a Matthew effect where we're seeing the distribution stretch out even more, and that middle ground is disappearing between, say, the haves and the have-nots in terms of who has access to education and the best forms of education with online experiences?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, I mean, I don't have any, it would depend what divide we're talking about, like whether it's internet access. Like, for example, internet access might be improving, but then you've got, the predominantly, a white middle class who are using technology for creating, a lot of media, for example, people that create the YouTube videos or whatnot. So we've got the creators of the media, we've got middle class kids doing coding, complex coding in their school holidays and before and after school and all these things. So and playing with drones, and there's this next level that certain middle class kids get access to that other kids are not. And that's why I think in schools we really need to be upping the ante, because there are some kids who are getting access to all of these technologies, and because they're not systematized through schooling, for example, like a really strong coding curriculum, where every child learns to code, then we're going to have these divides just continuing into the next generation, where we've got kids who just have these really advanced problem solving capabilities with any sort of technical thing they come up with. And then we've got kids who barely had access to an internet bar, the browser on their mum's phone, and to me, it is getting wider in that sense, in that what we're expected to know is getting higher.
Yeah. The benchmark's moving up, and our capacity to fill in that space between the rich and the poor is not necessarily keeping up with that. So what can we do about it? And also what can teachers do when they're faced with these situations where they know of these extreme difficulties in accessing, say, the internet or having access to certain technologies, even in your example, basic desktop computer access, so what can teachers do?
It depends on the setting. So in some cases, like I've heard of some schools who, for example, during the pandemic, they knew that their population had such poor access to the internet and computers. And because it was emergency lockdown learning, there wasn't time to buy all of that stuff and get funding for it and so on. They actually just had to make packs of print-based stuff and make worksheets and like work packs and deliver bundles of paper to families.
We certainly got our share.
They were not doing digital because we can't make sure everyone's got access. I mean, and then it can go from that to schools where they provided each family with an internet modem, so that they got a device like a laptop or an iPad and an internet connection with a prepaid plan. So there's different ways around it. I guess at the baseline that would be the basic would get them started, I guess. Starting
with the basic resources, but then there's also the problem you were mentioning before, where it's having teachers who understand the skill set for not only their own use of those things, but to empower others with the use of those things. And then there's that safety dimension, like you handing laptops and iPads to children and parents who potentially have never used them before, and that's the very reason you're giving it to them. But then there's the whole
training aspect,
training and to have privacy and safety online. That was certainly, I think, a weak spot in a lot of people's policies and systems in response to the pandemic and online education, emergency online education, I should say. Okay, so we're up to the stage of our podcast, the tail end of it, where I ask you big questions and you get to provide me with a pithy response. So just a brief sentence or two maximum for these answers. Feel like you can handle that?
Yes, not a problem.
All right, roll your sleeves up. So just a light question to begin. The purpose of education is?
To teach students how to think, not what to think.
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely agree. That's challenging. That's so challenging.
Mhm.
Okay, next question. The most important change that teachers can make to improve their teaching is?
I think it's to recognize that learning and intelligence are not fixed, but are open to continual growth and change. And then that way, whenever we meet a student, we know that what they know today is less than what they know tomorrow. And there's always room for growth, and not pigeonhole and label kids early in their lives, but actually allow for that growth to happen, because they will learn new things and they will be successful. And I think we need to have that in mind.
Yeah, and everyone can learn, can't they? That's the important
Exactly.
thing. Yeah. Okay, next question. The biggest strength of our teaching profession is?
I think our teachers are our biggest asset. They're one of society's biggest assets. And sometimes we call education the engine room of society. And I agree with that. I think the dedication of teachers is fundamental to Australia's future economy.
Not only the engine room, but the brains and the brawn and the heart, and I'd say the lifeblood of society, but I'm a little bit biased. That's why I'm in this job. Okay, next question. The most important work being done in the field of educational research, which is your wheelhouse, is?
Well, I think the important work is everywhere. It's going on globally across a broad range of issues. And I would say in my field, some of the big issues at the moment are things like AI in education and the ethics around AI. Extended reality technologies is a big one this decade because they're anticipated to peak in the next 10 years. So when we look at different rise and falls of technologies, that's one that's on the rise. I think the digital divide that we talked about, digital reading and writing, and how that's changing pedagogies for teachers to scaffold that digital reading and writing, and also debates around standardized testing of reading and writing.
Yeah. There's another couple of podcasts tucked away in that answer. I feel like I'm going to have to ask you back. All right, next question. If we keep doing blank, the education sector will be doomed.
I think failing to protect and respect the image and status of the teaching profession, for example, in media, in political and public discourse, using teachers as scapegoats for the inequity in society is just wrong.
Yeah, there's a big issue there. And I think we as a society don't know how to tackle that yet. Absolutely agree with you. Okay, next question. On the flip side, if we keep doing blank, the education sector will be a huge success.
I think allowing teachers to honour their own professional voice and values rather than trying to control teachers' work bureaucratically. So I think that if we want to keep teachers in the workforce and we want them to not have these inner conflicts around their daily work, we actually have to respect their values and the way they believe they need to teach.
Yeah, absolutely. You're talking about empowering them instead of taking away their agency. Yeah. Okay, now you're the queen of the castle. If you had $1 billion to spend on improving the educational sector, how would you spend it?
Well, this is a hard one in one sentence. I would say something like a big collaboration involving schools, higher education, and then you get industry experts as well in, different fields. Identify what each school community needs most and what they'll need in the future, and then design a program that leverages the community, the industry, and address those key problems. And then whether that be, new technology, cultural identity, development programs, teacher development, whatever it is, work on those problems for that school community using the resources both in and beyond the school. So not a one-size-fits-all solution, I'm afraid.
Oh, wow. Well said. Couldn't agree more. And I also, sense a bit of a political post-academic career on the horizon, perhaps, maybe. I'd put my tax dollars in your hands for sure.
I think I could deliver a good Julia Gillard misogyny speech, but I'm not sure I want to, unfortunately.
You will get your chance one day. Maybe I'll give you the opportunity to do that next podcast. Okay. The most important habit a graduate teacher can learn is?
I think to keep learning, gain new knowledge for your teaching, look at how to apply evidence-based research, as well as learning from other teachers who inspire you.
Yeah. Wow, that's cool. That's I kind of feel like that's how I would answer the question if I was as eloquent as you and as thoughtful as you. So well done. You've spoken for both of us there. The most meaningful change a school leader can make to improve the learning of their students is?
I would say to build a community of learners, starting with identifying your key teachers in your school, one on each year level, and those teachers then expertly guide teaching teams in core areas of the school's focus. I think, and I've seen that done. That's how I got this idea. I've seen principals do this really well.
So you've seen the exemplars, you know it can work. Yeah, absolutely. And then you sort of leaders creating leaders. It's a powerful system. Yep, well said. Next question. The educational researchers would improve the field of education if?
I think even if one student's life was changed by the findings, it's worth it. And that's my view of teaching as well. If you can make a difference to one student's life, then you've done something of good.
Totally agree with you. And I think it really speaks, I guess, pragmatically to people who do want to make a difference. Where do you begin? You begin with the one. You reach the many by beginning with the one.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're on to our final question.
Okay.
You can have a breath and relax after that. The most significant influence a person has had on your career is?
I would say I had a field experience mentor, like a supervisor in my internship, who was a tremendous role model for my own teaching, and she built up my confidence. Later, as an academic, it was a professor who identified my strengths and encouraged me, and was also a great role model.
Well, that resonates with me greatly, because that's what you are to me. You're an inspiration to me, and you've been a great role model to me. And I thank you so much for joining me on this podcast adventure. Thank you, Kathy Mills.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed our discussion with Professor Kathy Mills as much as I did. Upon reflecting on our conversation, there were some key points that really stood out to me. The first was about the multiple ways of engaging with texts and how this opens up a variety of possibilities for learners. The next point was that technologies in classrooms can have both a tremendous upside and downside for learning. One of these potential downsides was how it affects marginalised students, who often miss out most when there's the most to gain, and they often lose the most when there's the most to lose. And the final point was really a point of encouragement and edification. Teachers can and do make a difference, and the evidence is clear on that. So let me just summarise each of these points in turn. So one of the first points that Kathy made was to open our eyes up to the possibilities of alternative ways of knowing. Kathy's research suggests that there are many different ways to engage with text and to learn through all senses. And thank God that this is in fact true, because so many students become disengaged with conventional, unidimensional means of learning through written text. While these conventional ways of engaging with text still have their place and do dominate our ways of knowing through the traditional educational system, Kathy helps us to imagine not only an unlimited number of possibilities and alternative ways of knowing, but also helps us to see that cross-modal or multimodal texts can in fact provide a rich and synergistic experience for learning, where students are engaged with materials in a far more interactive manner so that they can build a richer body of knowledge as a result of that experience. The second thing that got me thinking was the tremendous upside and also the potential pitfalls of using digital technologies in conventional classrooms. The present generation are continually encouraged to embrace those digital technologies so that they are at the cutting edge of all the societal shifts, of all the digital innovations and the technological revolution. However, advances in our understanding of the consequences of using those technologies remain a work in progress, and the research often severely lags behind the technology itself. Kathy raised the point about students trying to concentrate on written texts while being inundated with distracting messages, notifications, alerts, and pop-ups on their screens. It's a noisy space to be if you're a student. Now, we know from the preliminary research on those things that those distractions have a tremendous detrimental impact on learning. And in many instances, some of those distractions outweigh the benefits of using those technologies. We've got to be careful to proceed with our eyes and our minds wide open so that we're able to critically evaluate both the benefits and the pitfalls of those technologies on our learners and their development of their literacies. Another point that Kathy raised was this idea of digital divides, and she emphasised the plurality of that term and how it might relate to any number of inequalities that emerge in our schooling context. Now, that could be to do with computers at home, high-speed internet, or even school holiday enrichment programs that encourage students to develop skills that allow them to take part in the creator economy so that they're not just passive consumers of that stuff. Kathy suggested that these trends have been amplified by our response to the global pandemic, where students were locked out of schools for months or even years, and they were left to their own devices, quite literally. Yet, amidst these desperate times, there were plenty of sunbeams penetrating those dark clouds in the forms of tireless teachers whose indomitable desire to help saw them dropping off realms of printed learning materials, Wi-Fi dongles, computers, and all sorts of resources for their students to remain connected to their schooling. Unfortunately, the research has shown us that across the world there are now millions of children who have never returned to schooling following the lockdowns in various countries, but this tragedy could have been a whole lot worse if it wasn't for some incredible teachers. And of course, not all heroes wear capes, but wow, let's give these teachers some respect for slugging it out over the last few years. The final point that I found quite empowering was that teachers, through the responsible and targeted use of multimodalities, multiliteracies, and various digital technologies, can help reach students that would otherwise be left on the margins of their schooling communities. Kathy has a real heart for learners on those fringes of society, and she mentioned a number of programs that can be targeted towards those who are left at the back of the pack. And fortunately, the research on this approach is unequivocal. Targeted educational interventions implemented early in life have ripple effects that help even the playing field later in life. And this is good news because teachers all want to make a difference to the lives of learners, but sometimes we fail to see the difference unfolding before our eyes, and so we forget how powerful our actions can be. So if that's you, if you're one of those teachers who's lost sight of why they're teaching, or you've been grinding through your lessons without seeing the fruits of your labour, you should be encouraged. Kathy Mills has spoken to reassure you that the literature and some of her own work strongly suggests that you make a difference, that targeted interventions for marginalised communities, for these students who are left at the back of the pack, can help them reach their potential. You can have a key role in breaking cycles of perpetual inequalities in the classroom. As Kathy mentioned in the last part of our discussion, even if one student's life is changed by our efforts, then it's worth it. Now that's about all we have time for in today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to know more about the release of upcoming content or support this program, I'll include links in the show notes. Until next time, may you continue to learn powerfully.